name is Dr. Robin. My name is Dr. Robin Kelso. I am a coordinator at the Kansas State Department of Education. We are super pleased to see everybody here today and appreciate you taking time to engage with today's summit. And just so you know, the summit has a mix of both school team participants, as well as different folks from agencies and organizations around the state. So we've got some new folks joining us today, and welcome to our partners. Feel free to use the chat box as we work our way through the summit. And next slide, please. And again, this is going to be recorded. So just a couple of reminders about the ECHO etiquette. Make sure that both audio and video are working. Mute yourself when you're not talking, please and thank you. Make sure if you are going to engage and speak, that you speak clearly, or feel free to use the chat box. We really want you guys to actively engage with us. It's really helpful too if your cameras are on and we can see your lovely faces, but understand that in some places the internet stability may be problematic, but really encourage you to have your cameras on so that we can see who's all here. So next slide. So attendance, make sure that as you're joining us via Zoom that you rename yourself. For school participants, please rename your USD number, school name, and then your first and last name. If you're in a group, please include your USD number and school and first names. And for everybody else who's joining us, please make sure you've got your first name and last name and organization as part of your name so that we can see who's attending. And this helps for Project ECHO so we can track who's here and who is not. So this is important, especially if you're wanting continuing education credits, because this is how we track our attendance. So next slide, please. So this is just a quick overview of how the ECHO series timeline comes together. You can see that we are on our second convening, I guess you would say, with the summit being the what's happening today. Last week we had an orientation, and then you can see September through November we'll have ECHO cohort meetings. Time to plan for action planning, and then in April we'll share out progress and just kind of see where we end up at the end of the school year. Next slide, please. This is an updated map thanks to the graphics wizards at KSDE. This is the ECHO Cohort 1 is in the orange. You can see how they are scattered throughout the state, and the same with 2, which is a red dot. And our most recent folks joining us, Cohort 3, those are our green dots. So you can see that geographically, we're kind of all over the state. We range in size from a little couple of smaller districts all the way up, 1A districts all the way up to 6A. So we are just delighted to have these school participants joining us, and grateful that you're willing to engage and in this ECHO vaping cessation and prevention program. Next slide, please. These are our partner agencies and schools. We're grateful for everybody's ability to engage with us, and we thank them from the bottom of our hearts that they feel that this is an important endeavor. Next slide, please. So here's what today is going to look like. Here in just a few minutes, I'm going to be turning it over to Babalola to introduce our speaker. Then we will have a panel discussion, a presentation from Ellie and Bryce on shifting your mindset and moving things forward. We'll end with a chance for you to ask questions. There'll be some closing remarks from yours truly. We have not built breaks in, but as you need to, we're all adults here. Feel free to get up and stretch and take a comfort break if needed at any point during this presentation. Next slide, please. Our disclosure for continuing education credits, the ECHO Hub team members and presenters at today's summit have nothing to disclose, so there's no conflict of interest on anyone's part, and you can see the names up there. Next slide, please. So for those of you to whom this applies, this is the continuing education statement for physicians, ARPNs, RNs, and social workers. If you are not in those categories, you can definitely request a certificate of attendance upon completion of documentation, if you need that for professional development points or any kind of professional development learning. Next slide, please. I will be sending this out also a little bit later on, either today or first thing tomorrow. But if you are interested in obtaining credits or certificate of attendance, you'll simply need to follow these directions. And again, I'll send them out. Don't feel like you have to run around and try and find things to write down, password and that other information. If you want to take a picture of the slide, however, that's probably not a bad idea. I believe the information also got dropped into chat, but again, if you're looking for continuing education credits, I will be sending this out following the conclusion of the summit, and you'll need to have your deadline to enter the code by September 5th, which is going to come up really fast since we have Labor Day coming forward. Next slide, please. So learning objectives for today is the importance of addressing e-cigarette use and vaping in schools. Obviously, that's why we're here. We feel like this is an issue that is a little bit different than your traditional discipline issues. And so today is looking at the importance of that e-cigarette use. We're going to provide examples of challenges in implementing vaping policy or practice change. We're going to provide examples of successes, those who have successfully implemented a vaping policy or practice change. And we're also going to describe best practices for implementing policy or practice change. So this is what hopefully you will take away from today's summit meeting. And I think with that, I now turn it over to Babalola. We have a guest speaker coming up and he's going to introduce her. But before we do, in the interest of Wi-Fi stability, we're going to ask all participants to turn off your cameras here just for the duration of this presentation. You'll be prompted to turn them back on once she is done presenting. But Babalola, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Robin. Good morning, everyone. I'm extremely delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Brenna Van Frank. Dr. Van Frank, I want to especially thank you for collaborating with us on this project since inception and for putting together a symposium at the last conference of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco in San Antonio, where we're able to showcase the work we were doing. Dr. Van Frank is the Senior Medical Officer in the Office on Smoking and Health at the CDC. She's board certified in pediatrics and preventive medicine, and is a member of the National Delta Omega Honorary Society in Public Health. Dr. Van Frank joined CDC in 2014 and has worked on a variety of public health topics. She serves as a scientific and medical consultant for OSH programs, communications, and projects, and her special interest is in the integration of healthcare and public health and the use of epidemiologic data for public health action. Dr. Van Frank, you're welcome, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And it is such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Apologies for the bandwidth. And then, can someone give me a shout out that you can see the right thing?
We do.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I just first want to be able to take a second and welcome Cohort 3. I think this project is fantastic. I'm so glad that you're all here, and it's such a pleasure to be able to join this incredible group again. As I say, I think every year being in a virtual room with so many educators that are dedicated to the well-being of youth is humbling and it's exciting. And personally, I'm grateful every day to the educators that have made me who I am, and to the educators that are now helping my daughter grow. Your impact on children's lives is truly profound. So I see you and I appreciate you. As a pediatrician and a preventive medicine doc, the topic of youth tobacco use is really close to my heart. And so it's encouraging to see strong advocates for youth like all of you embarking on projects like these to really tackle what is a concerning situation. So concerning that the US Surgeon General released an advisory in 2018 that called for action to protect the health of young people from e-cigarettes, which were and continue to be the primary form of tobacco use used by youth in our country. And at that time, the Surgeon General made it clear that achieving success in this is going to require multi-sector action. So everyone has a role to play in addressing youth tobacco use. You, as educators and school administrators and school health professionals, you are not alone in this fight, and you play a critical part in the effort. Now, we've known for a long time that school-based programs are a part of comprehensive tobacco prevention. I'm showing you here a conclusion from the 2012 Surgeon General's report on preventing tobacco use among youth and young adults. And basically, the bottom line here is that along with population-based strategies, such as mass media campaigns and comprehensive community and statewide programs, tobacco price increases, school-based programs can actually reduce the prevalence of tobacco use among school-aged youth. Now, I know that we're here to talk more about cessation than prevention, but it's important that I think we reflect on what evidence we have, what evidence we need to build on, and to make sure that we're coming at this issue from all sides, because prevention is a critical component as well. The work that you all are embarking on in the cessation space is really important. But my hope is today you're going to come away with sort of a solid foundation to get you started in all of that work. So my job this morning is to really help lay that foundation so that we're all on the same page starting forward. So I'm going to start by outlining the problem generally, again, so that we're all on the same page in terms of the products that we're talking about and what the drivers are of youth e-cigarette use. And then I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into tobacco dependence and talk about the components of nicotine addiction. And then last, I'm going to focus on youth cessation and sort of do a deep dive there. What evidence exists, what evidence doesn't exist, what promising practices are, and what resources are available. And then I'll wrap up by providing some thoughts about how to open conversations with youth about cessation and hopefully leave some time for questions. Okay, so starting with this general overview. So I think it's important to level set. There's a lot of kinds of tobacco products, right? There's combustible products, there's smokeless products, there's e-cigarettes, heated tobacco products, oral nicotine products, there's hybrid devices now. The tobacco product landscape really changes and shifts, and sometimes very rapidly. And each of these product classes also changes and shifts over time. So just as combustible tobacco products have evolved to include cigarettes and cigars and cigarillos and little cigars and hookah, e-cigarettes also include a variety of different types. So there's three major types of e-cigarettes that are currently in the US market. The first type is disposables. So these products come pre-filled. They're not intended to be refilled, typically not intended to be recharged, although that's changing somewhat in the marketplace right now. They may or may not be used multiple times, but the intention is they're supposed to be thrown away when they're out of liquid. They typically can look like manufactured cigarettes, or they can have other shapes like USB devices. Examples of this type of product are Puff Bar and some types of Elf Bar. There's also these devices, the disposable ones, are currently the most commonly used device type by middle and high school students. The second type is refillable e-cigarettes. So these are rechargeable. They have a tank or a chamber that you fill with e-liquid that you can purchase like in a bottle or can make on your own. These are sometimes called tanks or vape pens or mods. Some of these products can actually be taken apart and modified by the user, hence the term mod. And then the third type of e-cigarette are those with pre-filled cartridges or pods. So these can be recharged. They're intended to be used with a separately purchased pod, which is then discarded after use. The pod is what contains the liquid. And these products also come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Examples of this type are include Juul and Swarm. And when we're talking about the youth use of e-cigarette products, I think it's important that we put it into some context for other tobacco products. So here I'm showing you national level data on past 30-day tobacco product use reported by high school students in 2022. And you can see that e-cigarettes, of course, are the most commonly used product. They have been the most commonly used product since 2014. In 2022, an estimated 2.1 million high school students reported use of an e-cigarette in the last 30 days. The next most commonly used product in this group are cigars and then cigarettes, but you can see the difference in the prevalence of use is really quite substantial. The other striking thing that I think is important to be aware of is that a large proportion of youth use multiple products. So I'm not showing you the data here, but about 5% of high school students report current use of more than one product. And I think that's really important when we're talking about youth cessation, because for those kids, we can't be zoned in on just the e-cigarettes. We need to address all of the products that they're using. So this is what it looks like for middle school students. Again, national level data for 2022. There's a similar pattern here, but at lower rates than high school students. E-cigarettes, again, the most commonly used product, and then followed by cigarettes. Middle school students also use more than one product type, about 1.5% in 2022, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you look at the general numbers, that's a substantial proportion of kids who are using any tobacco. In Kansas, things look similar among high school students as they do at the national level. So about 14% of high school students reported use of electronic vapor products in 2021. Now, this data isn't directly comparable to the national data because the survey question is different. So notice I'm saying electronic vapor products here as opposed to e-cigarettes. And so that's just because of how the question is phrased on this survey versus the other. And though the surveys aren't comparable, this still can give you a pretty good sense of what's going on in your state. The other thing that I'd flag for you here is that cigarette use in Kansas high school students is quite a bit higher than what we see at the national level, but it's still obviously substantially lower than electronic products. I unfortunately don't have middle school data to show you for Kansas. The survey wasn't fielded for middle school students in 2021, but I imagine that it's similar to this type of pattern, but with lower prevalence as we see in the national level. So all of that data aside, I think the ultimate question is why, right? Why do kids use e-cigarettes? I think there's really 4 key factors to consider when we're talking about youth initiation. So those are advertising, social influences, flavors, and nicotine. And I'm going to take each of those things in turn. So starting with advertising, we know about 70% of students report exposure to e-cigarette advertising, and they're seeing it in all kinds of places. So retail is the largest presence, followed closely by the internet, and then print media, and then TV and streaming. So really, advertising is pretty ubiquitous in the youth space. And then there's social influences. So when we ask kids about their reasons for ever trying an e-cigarette, the most common reason was that a friend used them. And curiosity is also a common answer. I think it's also important to recognize that students may be trying e-cigarettes because of this misperception that it's going to help them cope with stress and anxiety. So about 1/4 of students report that they ever tried an e-cigarette because they were feeling anxious, stressed, or depressed. And with the rise that we've been seeing in poor mental health among youth, that's really no small concern. Another important context, about 1/4 report that they tried an e-cigarette to get high from nicotine. The other thing I think is important for your context is where kids are getting their products. So about 1/3 of students who use e-cigarettes report that they get their product from a friend. And then a big proportion report purchasing the products, either purchasing themselves or asking someone else to purchase for them. And I'm not showing you the data here, but those who do purchase them are primarily buying them at brick and mortar stores like vape shops and convenience stores, or just buying a product from someone else. Okay, so that was social influences. Now flavors. So most youth who use e-cigarettes report using a flavored product. That's true for both high school and middle school students. The most commonly used flavors are fruit, candy, mint, and menthol, which are all kid-friendly flavors. And then there's the nicotine. So nicotine, of course, is the addictive chemical in tobacco products. Most e-cigarette products that are sold do contain nicotine. And that's important because kids often don't know that there's nicotine in the device they're using. They may think they're only using liquid flavor. And the nicotine content's really important when we talk about youth use and health implications, because nicotine in and of itself is not harmless for kids. Nicotine's not only highly addictive, it poses unique dangers to young people. So we know nicotine can harm brain development, which of course we all know continues to about the age of 25. And we know that nicotine can harm the parts of the brain that control attention and learning, mood, and impulse control. And there's also some evidence that e-cigarette use in adolescence increases the risk of using combustible cigarettes later on. And of course, we're all generally familiar with the health consequences of cigarette smoking and what that implies. The other important thing to know is that the nicotine content of e-cigarettes has changed over time. So here I'm showing you e-cigarette sales data over time, so between 2017 and 2022, and then broken down by nicotine strength. So each of those little colored stacked bars is a different nicotine strength that's sold. And you can see here in the yellow bars that the proportion of products that have a nicotine strength of 5% or more has really increased substantially over time, with about 81% of unit sales in March of last year having a nicotine concentration of 5% or more, which is a lot. And you might be wondering why did this happen, or how did this happen? And the answer is nicotine salt. So to understand nicotine salt, I really need you to sort of harken back to high school chemistry and the pH scale. So the nicotine in cigarettes and earlier versions of e-cigarettes is something called free-base nicotine. So free-base formulations improve rapid delivery of nicotine into the brain. So you get a higher high and you get it faster. But that comes at a cost, because free-base nicotine is harsh. It has a basic pH and it hurts. What nicotine salt does is it takes free-base nicotine and adds some benzoic acid to it to pull the pH down, and that makes the formulation less harsh, which allows higher levels of nicotine to be inhaled more easily without that pain associated, which honestly, for the kid naive to nicotine, is the perfect bad package, right? Mango flavored, high concentration nicotine, really setting kids up for use, setting kids up for dependence or addiction. And we're going to talk about dependence in a moment. But first, I wanted to just clarify that it's not just nicotine in e-cigarette aerosol, right? There's also a variety of other chemical constituents in what they're inhaling. So e-cigarette aerosol, we know, can contain harmful and potentially harmful substances, including volatile organic compounds, ultrafine particles, heavy metals, some carcinogens, and other chemicals that have been linked to adverse health outcomes. And while there's still very limited data in terms of the long-term health effects of use of e-cigarettes, we do know that e-cigarette aerosol is not just harmless water vapor. And then the liquid in e-cigarettes can also contain a variety of other substances. So e-liquid in and of itself is a mixture of a variety of substances, which can include humectants for aerosolization, sometimes flavorants like we've talked about. E-liquids can also contain cannabinoids, which is particularly important in the context of youth use, because we have data that shows that cannabis use in e-cigarettes among youth has actually been increasing in recent years. And there's also some evidence that e-cigarettes can be hacked or modified to deliver illicit drugs, including synthetic cannabinoids and other stuff like heroin and meth. And all of this has implications for your work, because the teens you're trying to help may have multiple substance dependencies, including nicotine and cannabis. Today, we're just going to focus on nicotine and tobacco dependence, but when you're thinking about these interventions, I would encourage you to consider these other elements as well. And then the other important contextual factor here is something that you already inherently know. Tobacco use does not exist in a vacuum. There are a slew of structural forces at play here. So when we're talking about preventing and treating tobacco use, I think it's important that we acknowledge that stress, anxiety, social influences, socioeconomic stressors, structural inequities, tobacco industry targeting of teens, all these things serve a role in driving youth tobacco use, which means that when we're trying to help kids quit, we need to have a global whole kid perspective. Okay, so let's talk about what tobacco dependence actually looks like. If there is one thing that I want you to remember from this whole talk, it's this. Tobacco dependence is a chronic, relapsing condition that is driven by addiction to nicotine. We know that repeated nicotine use changes the brain, including the parts of the brain that help exert self-control. And there's a number of components to this addiction. There's a physical and biochemical component to addiction. So removal of nicotine from a brain that's biochemically dependent on that substance manifests as withdrawal. And we're going to talk about withdrawal symptoms in a little bit in greater detail. There's also a behavioral component that's manifested through triggers and daily routines that cause a brain to want nicotine. We're going to talk about triggers in much more detail in a little bit. And then there's also a psychological, social, and emotional component. That's typically manifested through social cues or emotional triggers that cause a person to want to reach for nicotine. Bottom line here, all of this means that it is hard to quit on your own, even when someone wants to quit, feels ready to quit, or recognizes that using is harmful, it's still really hard. And understanding this, I think, is key to understanding the types of support that we need to give for successful cessation. And it's also key to understanding why tobacco use in youth is so concerning. Because the adolescent brain is uniquely susceptible to nicotine addiction because it's still developing. So youth show signs of dependence pretty quickly, sometimes even before the onset of regular or daily use. And we know that nearly all tobacco use begins during adolescence or young adulthood. About 90% of adults who smoke cigarettes daily report first trying smoking before the age of 18. And we also know that, as we've said before, e-cigarette use among youth may increase the risk for future cigarette smoking. Bottom line here is that youth tobacco use is not benign experimentation. It's an immediate health concern. And it's even more concerning when kids start to show signs of dependency and addiction. So understanding sort of some common behaviors that are associated with addiction and dependency can be important for us to be able to flag kids that may need more help. So I've listed some of those common behaviors here. I'm not going to read all of these to you. I think you'll get the slides later. But you'll see things in here like giving up important activities because of substance abuse, getting into trouble because of substance use, damage to relationships with family and friends, experiencing tolerance, which is when you need more of a substance to feel normal or to get high, and experiencing withdrawal, which again, those physical symptoms that manifest when a body that's used to having a substance is suddenly deprived of that substance. In kids, one of the early signs of nicotine dependence may be how frequently they use. So I'm showing you here data from, again, that 2022 national survey looking at middle and high school students who report current use of e-cigarettes. Bottom line here is that a lot of youth who vape do so frequently. So among high school students, 30% report vaping daily, 46% report using nearly daily, and that is worrisome. One of the other early signs of nicotine dependence is experience of nicotine withdrawal. So let's dive into what that actually looks like, because I think I've mentioned it several times at this point. So remember, again, withdrawal occurs when a brain that's biochemically dependent on a substance is deprived of that substance. So in other words, if a brain needs nicotine to feel normal and it doesn't get nicotine, it's going to protest, and potentially protest a lot. Good news is it gets better. So as the brain gets used to not having nicotine around anymore, withdrawal symptoms do subside over time. Common withdrawal symptoms include irritation, anxiety, restlessness, difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping, headaches, feeling down, even feeling hungry. And it's important to help youth recognize that what they are feeling is actually nicotine withdrawal. It's also important to remind them that that's temporary and that there are strategies that they can use to help cope with the symptoms. This all said, I want to note that even though having some feelings of sadness are a normal part of withdrawal, extreme sadness or depression does need immediate attention and shouldn't be dismissed or ignored. Okay, so understanding nicotine addiction and nicotine withdrawal can really give us some additional context for better understanding drivers of youth tobacco use. So remember, we talked a little bit ago about the reasons kids reported trying e-cigarettes. The most common answer was because friends used them, right? When we ask kids about why they currently use e-cigarettes, the most common answers are feeling anxious, stressed, or depressed, and to feel a nicotine high. So let me contextualize that just a little bit. Nicotine addiction itself can be a form of stress. So remember, nicotine withdrawal can manifest as feelings of anxiety, feelings of sadness or depression, feelings of restlessness or irritability, all of which can be quite stressful or feel like stress. So people who are addicted to nicotine may try to treat those feelings by using nicotine, which can help relieve the withdrawal symptoms for a short amount of time, right? The brain gets its nicotine back, and so it feels more normal again. And that cycle can really lead to this cycle of nicotine dependence. And all of that is on top of all of the stress that kids are dealing with to begin with. So when we're talking to teens about vaping, teaching them about addiction, how to recognize withdrawal, linking those things to how they're feeling, those are all really important so that they can recognize this potential cycle. Okay, so moving on from withdrawal and getting deeper into triggers. So remember, there's those other two components of tobacco dependency, right? There's this behavioral piece and the psychological, social, emotional piece. And those two can manifest through triggers, right? Certain situations, people, emotions that create cravings or the desire to use tobacco. Everybody's going to have different triggers, but there are some triggers that can be a bit more common. And there's three big categories of trigger types that many youth are going to experience. So the first type is situational. So those are triggers that are related to daily routines. So things like being on the phone, going to the school bathroom, even seeing e-cigarette advertisements can all be triggers. There's a variety of coping strategies that can help, really reminding students that changing up routines to reduce those triggering moments can be helpful. And then non-tobacco replacement behaviors can also help. So things like doodling or exercising or gum chewing. The next type of triggers are social triggers. So those may actually be particularly challenging for teens since so much of their life is really related to how they relate to their peers. There's a variety of coping mechanisms here as well, but it might be helpful to remind students that they have plenty of things in common with their friends other than vaping, that it's normal for friends to grow apart, and that it's best to spend time with people who want you to succeed in the things that you want to accomplish. And really that it's crucial to avoid specific social situations that may tempt them to vape. The last category of triggers is emotional triggers, and those are important to validate for teenagers. So emotional triggers really can run the gamut from stress, anxiety, boredom, anger, even happiness, excitement, or feelings of celebration can be triggers. And I think it's also important to remind students that it's okay that quitting is hard, but that the important part is to seek support and really keep going. Reminding them that caring for themselves is a really crucial part of success. But again, extreme sadness or depression beyond sort of the hard day is really important to get addressed swiftly. Okay, so we've talked about dependency, what that looks like. We've talked about withdrawal, we've talked about triggers. And I think all of that context can help us better understand what's needed for treatment and for cessation. So I want to dive into that a little bit for you. So starting with some data, because as you heard, I love taking some data and applying it for public health action. So I hear sometimes this misperception that kids just aren't interested in quitting. And the bottom line is the data say otherwise. In fact, over half of kids who use tobacco products report that they want to quit, and over half have tried to in the last year. So next time somebody tries to tell you that there's nothing we can do about this because kids just don't want to, you tell them about this data and change their mind. So how do we help? Well, I know we're talking about kids today, but for context, let me start with what we know about how to treat adults for tobacco use and dependence. So we know that treatment is most successful when we approach it comprehensively. So treating all aspects of the addiction, the physical and biochemical, the behavioral, the psychological, social, emotional pieces. And this is best accomplished in adults through a combination of counseling and medication. This is an evidence-based approach. There's a significant research base that tells us that each of these elements works, that the combination works even better, and that there's a variety of ways that these interventions can be accomplished. Unfortunately, the same is not true for youth. So we have, frankly, a very limited evidence base on how to help kids quit. The additional bad news is that there's even more limited information on how to help people, including youth, quit e-cigarettes. Most of our evidence base is regarding quitting smoking cigarettes. There are, however, some promising practices and some parallels that we can draw between treating adults and treating kids. Bottom line here is that kids do need help quitting, and that youth influencers should really encourage and support cessation. And so to that end, there's a ton of really smart people working on this practice gap and in this evidence-based gap. And a couple of years ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics gathered some of the leading experts in the area of youth tobacco cessation to really examine promising practices and to develop a resource for helping pediatric healthcare providers navigate how to help kids quit. That group came up with this framework. It's called the ACT model. It's intended to guide and support tobacco use screening and treatment. So it starts with asking about tobacco use, moves to counseling, quitting, and then shifts to treating dependence with behavioral supports and possibly medication when indicated. So now I know you're all thinking to yourselves, how does this relate to school again? Well, and I think in two ways. So first, I think it's important for you all to see how the clinical folks in the field are approaching this challenge of helping kids quit in the face of a limited evidence base. And second, because I think that this may influence how you can talk to kids about quitting and what to potentially expect when you refer them for help. So in this resource from AAP, the mainstays of treatment are patterned after what we do for adults, right? There's counseling, and then when indicated, potentially medication. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time and just talk to you about those two components. So starting first with counseling. So counseling comes in a variety of types. It can be behavioral counseling, like cognitive behavioral therapy. It can be practical counseling. It can be supportive messaging. Typically, it's some combination of all of those things. And the key components to counseling involve building a quit plan, helping a kid understand nicotine dependence, recognize withdrawal and triggers, just as we've been talking about. It also involves building tools for coping with those triggers, coping with withdrawal, and building a network of social supports, engaging in supportive self-care behaviors, and really learning strategies for coping with stress and anxiety that don't involve nicotine use. And again, we're going back to that whole child model, right, where tobacco use doesn't occur in a vacuum. Counseling type support can really be delivered through a variety of formats. So there's in-person, phone, text messaging, web-based, app-based services. Those are all available. I've listed here some reputable programs that are designed for youth trying to quit tobacco use, and these are all available to kids in Kansas. While none of these is necessarily proven to be effective for helping kids quit e-cigarette use, again, because of that limited evidence base, all of these are based in solid theory and promising practices, and now at this point have several years of application and working on it. So if you were going to send kids somewhere for help, in addition to sending them to their pediatrician, this would be a really good place to start. I also want to flag for you that the Quitline program that's available in Kansas, there is one available for youth. So your state Quitline, it serves both adults and kids, has a specific program for youth called My Life, My Quit. And it's a multimodality program. It involves interaction with a quit coach and supportive text messages. It's free to those who use it. It's confidential. And I think it's wonderful that this program is available to youth in your state because it can really give kids that extra counseling and support that they may need to successfully quit. Okay, so that's counseling. I also want you to be familiar a bit with the medications. Why do I want you to be familiar with them? Well, the bottom line here is that as a pediatrician, I think that educators are a critical player in a kid's care team. And I figure you all probably rather be familiar with the medications that you might see students coming to school with. So to that end, there's 3 medications you're most likely to see at school, and those are the first 3 here. So nicotine patch, nicotine gum, and nicotine lozenge. Now, remember, I'm going to say it again because repetition is our friend. When a brain is used to having nicotine around, stops getting nicotine, then you end up with withdrawal symptoms. So nicotine replacement therapy, or NRT, it's a medication that provides a controlled amount of nicotine at a lower dose to address the withdrawal symptoms while the brain is sort of relearning what normal is without the nicotine from tobacco products. All of these medications need a prescription for use in youth because none of them are FDA approved for kids. That includes those that are available over the counter for adults. So again, patch, gum, and lozenge. Now, as a pediatrician, I think I'd want my patients' teachers to know some very specific things about these medications. So first, the patch is a once-a-day dose. You put it on once a day and you wear it the whole day. Gum and lozenge need to be taken throughout the day as needed to control symptoms. And that may be as frequently as every 2 hours, depending on the level of nicotine dependency that we're treating. I would also want you to know that these medications are not used like typical gum or typical like cough drop lozenge type medication. So you don't chew nicotine gum like chewing gum. You chew it a few times and then you park the gum between your cheek and your gum line just for a little while. And then you chew it and then you park it on the other side. So it's sort of this intermittent chew and wait. There's also 2 other short-acting NRTs, the oral inhaler, the nasal spray. I'm going to guess that you're less likely to see these, but just in case you've heard about them once. There's also additionally 2 pill medications that I have not displayed here that youth may be prescribed, but as educators, you're likely not going to encounter those because the dosing's twice a day, just morning and evening. So that shouldn't be coming to school. Okay, so coming back more solidly to the school environment, I told you that there was one element that I wanted you to take home today, right? So, and that's that cessation is a process because tobacco dependence is chronic, it's relapsing, it's driven by addiction to nicotine, and it often requires repeated intervention and long-term support. That long-term support comes from multiple sources. So everywhere that a youth is in the day is a potential source of support or a potential triggering event. And that's why trigger-free environments are so important. Trigger-free environments include tobacco-free environments, which means having a tobacco-free policy. Now, I know you all have this vape-free schools toolkit that you're using to guide your schools and districts in becoming tobacco-free. I'd encourage you to continue working on those policies and effectively implement and clearly communicate and regularly enforce and support a tobacco-free campus. Supportive environments are also focused on rehabilitation. So we know that punishment-focused environments are likely to drive youth into deeper and more secretive addiction. I think that's particularly important for both parents and educators to understand, especially as we talk about quit attempts and slips and relapse. Because every quit attempt is a learning opportunity and relapse is not failure. Remember, quitting's hard, right? Repeated nicotine exposure changes the brain. And so we have to give the brain time to heal and change back and learn how to be without nicotine. I think it's important to help youth and parents and even yourselves remember that every quit attempt is a learning opportunity. It's a chance to figure out how to do it differently next time. And it's another step towards successful quitting. It's really easy for kids to get discouraged. It's easy for parents and doctors and educators to get discouraged, but it is so critical to not let kids give up on themselves and honestly to not give up on them. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in any great detail is some best practices or suggestions in terms of approaching youth about quitting. This is, we'll start with the student that's just not interested or says they're not interested, or maybe is just starting to think about quitting. So this is about opening the door to discussions with youth, really getting them to think about what their substance use might be doing to them, what quitting might look like. So the general principles are things that, are typical for talking to teenagers, right? So being clear, being personalized, explaining the benefits. So let me give you some concrete examples. So first, so you can be clear about the effects of using. For example, just a simple statement: nicotine can harm your brain development. Or when you vape, you're inhaling chemicals and heavy metals, and that can injure your lungs. You can also be personalized and explain the benefits of quitting. So something like, I know you run cross country. Quitting smoking can help your lung capacity, which may help you run further and faster. And you can also help them start making links to understanding nicotine addiction. So things like, that anxious feeling that you're describing really sounds like it could be nicotine withdrawal. That might tell you that you are starting to develop an addiction. Now, if you have a student who's it's maybe in the headspace of thinking about quitting or ready to take, or is starting to think about being ready to take the next step, I would consider adding some things. So again, being supportive. Quitting's really hard, but I believe in you and I know that you can do it. Encouraging action, so getting them to commit to a quit date. I'm so glad you're interested in quitting. What do you think about setting a quit date in the next couple of weeks? Offering them some resources. And you can go back to that resource slide that I showed you earlier. And really reflecting back to them that whole kid approach, right? Like, it sounds like you're smoking or vaping to deal with stress. Did you know that nicotine addiction can actually be a source of stress? Maybe I can offer you some suggestions of other ways that you can cope. And then, of course, we've all run into this kid, right? The kid who just doesn't want to hear it. They're convinced they can stop anytime they want. For those, consider challenging that belief system by proposing. Oftentimes this helps kids understand withdrawal, triggers, dependence, at which point you can jump in with your supportive and personalized and clear messages about addiction. Okay, so wrapping up here, the bottom line is that you all have this really important role in protecting students from tobacco, including e-cigarettes. You're not alone in that role, but you do have a special place in these children's lives that is so critical. And there are some powerful things that you can do to help support kids. So things like engaging students in discussions about the dangers of tobacco product use, develop, implementing, and enforcing tobacco-free policies which address all tobacco types. Remember, this isn't just about prevention of use, it's also about providing trigger-free environments for those who are trying to quit or are in recovery. Using prevention programs that are free from industry influence, and then being supportive of kids who are trying to quit, encouraging them, connecting them to resources. You all are taking hugely important steps by engaging in this project. I'm really excited to hear about all the amazing things that your cohort is going to do. I'd also just like to offer you, again, you think you'll get the slides, so don't feel like you have to scribble these down, but some additional resources are available both from CDC and FDA that might be able to help you in your journey. So whether you're in the classroom or in the counselor's office or out on the field, I'd encourage you to just have conversations with your students, have conversations with them about stress, about tobacco use, remember those underlying root causes, support those that are trying to quit, because this is really hard work, right? It's hard work for them, it's hard work for you. So don't give up on yourselves. It's going to be fine. You're going to do great. And don't give up on them. I think the bottom line, my main message here for you is that you already have the skills, right? You already have those resources to make a difference in these young lives. You have a role here, embrace it, but know that you're not alone. Let's keep up the good fight together. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your work in the future, and I really appreciate you being here with me today. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Frank. I was able to capture a quote from your presentation, and I'm going to say it. E-cigarette is not just nicotine, it's not just flavoring, it contains a cocktail of harmful substances. I think that's a food for thought. We have about a few minutes for questions, and please raise your hands if you have some questions that Dr. Van Frank will be able to answer. Or if you want to put your questions in the chat, we'll be monitoring that. Question time.
So Babalola, we do have a question in the question and answer section of Zoom. So it says, thank you for your presentation. The question is, what are the effects of NRT on a developing brain?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And like I said, the evidence base for youth cessation is minimal. There have been some randomized control trials looking at nicotine replacement therapy use in kids. In those trials, there were no identified safety concerns with use of NRT. It's a low dose in comparison to what you get from tobacco product use. But there's a reason, right, why these medications need to be prescribed by a physician. And the conversation with the pediatrician and the child and their care provider and their guardians needs to walk through those kinds of risk versus benefit conversations. So the other thing to keep in mind is that NRT use, when used in kids and adults, is not intended to be for extended periods of time. So the intention here is to get them off of nicotine all and all together, and not sustain that addiction. NRT is it's to help relieve those withdrawal symptoms so that they don't go back to tobacco product use. I hope that's helpful and answers your question.
So as a related question, if NRT is not FDA approved for kids under 18, what are other tools kids under 18 can use?
Can you repeat that question? Sorry. What are other tools that kids can use? I see. So yes, these medications are not approved by the FDA for use, but there are, and I think that maybe the other pediatrician on the panel can help address some of this as well during the panel conversation. But the pediatricians use medications off label for children a lot, and so again with conversation. Yes, thanks, Mandy. It's prescribed off label, and it's not the only medication that is prescribed off label for children. So these medications are available when in consultation with the child's doctor, but space here is growing and needs to be researched in more depth, and there's a lot of smart people doing that, which I'm glad for. But that slide that you'll get that shows all of the different resources in terms of phone counseling and text programs and online resources are all available as well.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? And if you would like to unmute, please feel free to do so. Raise your hand and we can call you so you can verbalize if you would like to do that. Thank you, Dr. Ollinger. Dr. Ollinger has already put some thoughts in the chat. And she will be on the panel as well. So any other questions? All right, hearing none, I just want to thank you, Dr. Van Frank, again for this amazing presentation. Concise.
Always a pleasure, and good luck to everyone on your projects. You guys, Pablo, you know how to get a hold of me if you need me.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for that outstanding presentation. Next up, we have our panel discussion. I'm sorry to inform you that the word had gone out that Kirby Nutt of Northeast High School, who participated in Cohort 2, had planned to join us, but is not able to be here today. However, we have Vince Colorado, and I'm sorry if I butchered that, from Cohort 1, who has kindly agreed to step in as a panelist. And now I will invite Bryce Chitanavong to introduce his panelists for today.
Good morning, guys. My name is Bryce Chitanavong. I'm the Youth Tobacco Prevention Coordinator with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. There we go. Now I'm starting to see some of my panelists. Before we kind of get started into this, I do want to preface this by just saying this is kind of going to be more of an informal breakout session. Panelists, if you have questions for each other, please feel free to ask. If you're in the audience and you just have a question that you want to be answered by a certain panelist, please write down the name who you'd like to have answered, or just kind of make it a general question, and we'll address those throughout the panel discussion. You certainly don't have to wait till the end. Also, if you feel the need, you can raise your hand and unmute and ask those questions as well. But with all that said, I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves and give a little bit of background, and we'll start with Vince.
I'm Vince Nacarado, principal at Reno Valley Middle School in Nickerson, South Hutchinson District, and we were a member of the first cohort group, and so we've gone through this process and learned quite a bit as a school. And I am available if you have questions to kind of need any guidance and support on implementing a policy that would be effective. We've got a lot of students who are really supportive of what we're trying to do, and we think we're making a difference. Again, a lot of experience in dealing with this. I know the overwhelming feeling you guys are going through right now. So feel free to contact me at any time if you have questions.
Thank you. Dr. Ollinger?
Good morning. This is also my second, gosh, we've done this, it feels like a lot of times, and it's been a wonderful experience. And I always learn new things, which is fantastic that I can take back to my patients. So I'm a pediatrician at KU Marillac, and Marillac is our inpatient psychiatric facility. So I happen to care for patients who do engage in higher risk activities, because we know that kids who suffer from mental illness also engage in high risk activities, including substance use. And so I deal with vaping and other tobacco product use and cannabis use on a daily basis with my patients. And I learn things from them all the time. And I also learn ways from them that they've been able to quit or help their friends or family members quit. So I'm in a unique position in my department as a pediatrician in that I see the most of substance use out of our patient population. So that's why I'm here, to help out in any way I can. And thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you. Jody?
I'm Jody Hayner, and President and the CEO of the Healthy Bourbon County Action Team. I think this is my second or third time coming to be a panelist for the ECHO cohort. So it's always great to come and speak with like-minded individuals. I also serve as a regional coordinator for the KU Med COPE program through Southeast Kansas. We've been a Blue Cross Blue Shield Pathways to Healthy Kansas community since 2016. Our mission is to increase access to healthy food, physical activity, promote tobacco cessation, enhance quality of life, and encourage economic growth. We've successfully implemented tobacco or smoking or vaping policy in work sites and higher education, school district, and multi-unit housing complexes. So great to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Tony.
Good morning, everyone. Tony Woolen with Shawnee Mission School District Police. This is the third ECHO that I participated in. Currently assigned to a high school. We have about 1,700 students here, but the school district itself, we have jurisdiction to go anywhere throughout the Shawnee Mission School District. Kind of a different approach. Those of you that have SROs in your buildings, our door's always open. We have kids in and out all the time, and focus really on relationships with the kids. But 30 some odd years in law enforcement, and ex-board member, National Association of School Resource Officers, and started Kansas Association of School Resource Officers. So just glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So Vince, let's start with you. You said you had you were a part of Cohort 1. Can you tell us about your ECHO experience and how how you work to change your school's culture and mindset?
Well, first of all, I had to get a team that I could really count on, and wanted to make some change. So, I had a couple teachers, and of course myself, my counselor, our school resource officer was a part of that. And it ended up being that we actually got a member of the health department, Reno County Health Department, on our team. And that has proved to be a very, very beneficial process. Even today, we still work very closely with Reno County Health Department. So, but yeah, one of the things we wanted to do was start a resist chapter, and we did. And we've got some kids who are very outspoken against vaping, and it is a huge district huge concern in our district. And with the community that cares data was showing that we have a problem, and we knew we did, and we knew that suspending kids was not effective. Kids would go home and they would vape, and so we really realized we needed to make a change in how we approach this. And so that was also a motivator as to why we joined that first ECHO.
And so you were a part of Cohort 1. So, now you're 2 years removed from it. Can you tell us maybe what year 1 to 2 looked like versus what year 2 to 3 is looking like?
There's a lot of refinement. We had our initial policy that we shared, with our other ECHO teams, and we've kind of revised that. We've done some things that we feel like have strengthened what we're trying to do. in fact, we rewrote our policy a little bit so that we could actually get the Pathways grant, and we're using that to help fund our Resist chapter and what they're trying to accomplish. And we're getting those kids more active in our district, and especially going down to the 2 elementary schools that feed us. So that's one of the things that we've done. This year will be our first full year with using e-hall pass, and that has really helped stop a lot of the meetups that students were doing in the restrooms and stuff to meet and vape. So it's a learning process, and we're continuing to learn. And the kids, it seems like a lot of times the ones who want to vape, though, they're one step ahead of us, because there's always something new that we're learning about. Now we're looking for the highlighters that are that are vapes. So
it is interesting you mentioned the highlighters. I hadn't heard of them at all, and now I've heard about it 3 times in like the past 2 weeks. It's just crazy how those emerging products just hit the market so quickly.
And getting the kids to understand how they are targeted is a major thing, because why do you need something that looks like a USB drive? Why do you need something that looks like a marker? Why do you need something that is secretive in a hoodie? It's all geared towards those kids. Of course, the flavors as well. One thing that we're really going to do this year also is we're getting in a presenter. Victor DeNoble is going to visit with our students, and then we're going to schedule him to have a few nights later. We're going to have an open house at our school and invite parents and people from the community to come in. And he is incredible to have talk about addiction. So we're trying to increase the education that we're doing. So, and that's a nonstop process for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, now that you're implementing these different vaping initiatives, what's some of the feedback you're hearing from your colleagues?
I get asked a lot about, are we making a difference? I like to think we are. I don't know. But the feedback has been pretty good, especially within our district. I think we're finally getting our high school to maybe make some changes and realizing that, hey, when a kid has a vaping problem, it's not just a school punitive issue. I mean, it's a deeper issue than that. And we've got some kids that, I had multiple times that they offended, and we just continue to hammer the education and provide them with resources and talk with parents and try to, the motivational interviewing process that we learned about in our ECHO. We try to use that. We do everything that we can to help those kids out.
I have someone asking for the name of the speaker. If you could just provide them in the chat.
Yeah. Victor is he was one of the main whistleblowers on the tobacco industry in the 80s and early 90s, and he doesn't really focus strictly on tobacco, but the addiction process and what happens to the brain through that process. And he'll talk about how he was doing some secretive things for the tobacco industry, and the experiments he was doing on rats and things, and what he found out about how brains become addicted. So,
and then so I understand, I'm the youth tobacco prevention man for KDHE, so tobacco just seems like this whole world to me, but I understand schools just face so many other issues. Can you tell us maybe why this issue is different than other school issues?
For me, it's a health issue for our kids. It's a mental health issue for kids, and that makes it challenging. We really saw such an uptick in the vaping right after the pandemic, and so that's, to me, that's what makes it difficult. There is no clear cut, oh, you just do this and the problem's solved. Each kid that goes through this process or addiction, if they are addicted already, it's a unique situation for them, and you have to look at each kid is different.
Awesome. Thank you, Vince.
You bet.
So now we'll transition over to you, Dr. Olinger. Can you tell us about a case where vaping had a negative impact on youth health outcomes?
Oh, absolutely. So it's hard to narrow down to one. Actually, I'll give you a more generic situation because I see it a lot where I've got a patient coming in for worsened depression or worsened anxiety. And part of that is related to their addiction to nicotine and their need for nicotine. And say, for instance, that they got caught at school or parents found out and they took away all of their basically what the patient has been or the student has been using for a coping strategy. So a lot of my patients use substances to help to relieve, basically escape or feel more normalized when things are not going well. And so much of the time, they get that within their family. So parent smoke is a way of stress relief. And so it's a learned behavior a little bit there. And so they'll come to me and say, for instance, they're not doing well or they quit a sport. That's, so much social support there in participating in a sport at school, or they are not doing well in marching band because their lung capacity is not what it used to be. And so I see patients with ENT issues. So we've got sore throats, voice change, smaller lung capacity to be able to participate in the things that they wanted to. And then it's one of the telltale signs that a kid's having issues with it is throat clearing. So they're within our respiratory system, we have these little molecules that have these tiny fingers on them called cilia, and they help us to clear our secretions and all the things that we make naturally to help coat our respiratory system and keep us safe. So whenever those are destroyed by vaping, by the chemicals that they inhale, they don't have anything to move that along. And so our kiddos who are engaging in the various forms of vaping, they're not able to get rid of the things that the way that we need to. So they get worsened infections. If they get COVID, it's worse than, and we have data to show that a person who is smoking or vaping and gets COVID has worse outcomes than somebody who does not. And so my kids who come in who have been struggling with this also have respiratory issues, who have throat clearing issues, sinus problems. I've had issues, kids who are having problems with ear infections, all of the above, secondary to their vaping or smoking. And the reason I say smoking is a lot of times when my patients run out of their vapes or say they got taken away or confiscated for whatever reason, their next step is to use whatever is available with nicotine. And sometimes that's sneaking parents cigarettes. So smoking might be the next step. And they never intended to smoke. A lot of my patients are like, oh, gross, cigarettes are gross, because they've grown up learning that smoking is not good in our society, but vaping is. And vaping is just a gateway to other nicotine products. So I see a lot of respiratory problems and a lot of performance issues in terms of sports and academics.
So, I'll give you kind of a hypothetical situation. So a student is coming in. What are kind of some of the early warning signs that maybe they are developing that nicotine dependence, that nicotine addiction? And then how do you approach that conversation with not just the student, but with the parent and guardian as well?
Okay, so one of the things, first off, they might be coming to see me for an upper respiratory infection because they're just more susceptible to those infections. But say, for instance, they're having a harder, food doesn't taste as good. It also impacts our taste buds. It impacts our our ability to smell as well. And so I see a lot of decreased appetite, both because of the actual anatomical changes that happen within the mouth and respiratory system, but also because nicotine drives down your appetite. And so we have kiddos that are losing weight, and whenever they're not getting adequate nutrition, they don't do as well in school. They can't concentrate as well because they don't have the sugar that their brain needs to concentrate. So some of the earliest things that I see is decreased appetite, weight loss. They don't sleep as well because of nicotine. It keeps you awake. I kind of equate it to help them understand it's a lot like caffeine as a molecule. So think if you drank a Monster right before bed, if a kiddo's sneak in their vape in their room at nighttime and just sitting there and hitting on it throughout the evening, and then they need to go to bed, that's very difficult for their brain to turn off. And so they've got lack of sleep, they've got less nutrition, which sets them up for more infections and not doing well in school. So I talk to parents, especially those who maybe themselves vape or thought that that might be a great way for them to quit smoking. So they transition to vaping because it's also marketed that way as a way to quit smoking. And so parents may not see an issue with it, but those are really obvious signs that your child's having a problem. Is your kid not able to get adequate sleep at night or good quality sleep at night? Have they been losing weight, or where did their appetite go? They need those real essentials for growth, both mentally and physically, and to do well at school and to be their best selves. And most parents want their kids to be able to be their best selves. So even though those things may seem trivial, over time, it's a really big deal.
So how do you have the conversation with parents?
Basically pointing out those details. So most of the time, if they're seeing me and they know that their child vapes or smokes, and obviously the health issues that we talk about from a respiratory standpoint and infection standpoint, those things, I think parents kind of wait for those problems to come up a little bit, like, oh, if that happens, we'll deal with it. But then I say, we really want your kid to have the best quality of life. And those little changes that you're seeing, those little sounds of throat clearing, those are signs that your kid is not doing well. Those are the first signs to tell you that the inside of their body is not doing okay. And this is going to lead to a bigger problem. Not only that, but nicotine addiction is really hard to kick. And the earlier the brain sees nicotine, the harder it is to let go of it. So we know that most people who have nicotine addiction did start earlier in life. And the reason being is because the brain is super susceptible to that. So I talk to parents in terms of, what do you want to see for your child's future? What do you want that to look like for your kid? Because we can make that happen and start that process now if we get on top of it. And then I engage them with asking them what their goals are for their kid. So I kind of let them lead the discussion. It's a little bit like motivational interviewing. What does your family look like? What do you want your child's future to look like? And then letting them set the stage and then deciding what would work for them as a family. And so letting them kind of direct the conversation from there, and then kind of supporting with all the reasons that from a health standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, socially, and from an educational standpoint, how that's going to all play a part.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And then, Dr. Van Frank did mention, NRTs and such.
Mm-hmm.
As a pediatrician yourself, what does that look like for you? What does tobacco treatment look like for you and your patients?
So first, I need to know their level of addiction. I need to know if this is a person who intermittently uses nicotine, or if it's a chronic use pattern like an adult where they really can't set it down. They really do need something to get them through, so that they don't reach for their vape to get that experience that they need. So basically, it is providing a low level of nicotine in the bloodstream so that it will curb the craving, so they can make it throughout the day without it. And that's how I explain it. It's not the same as hitting a vape. Whenever you're using nicotine replacement, it doesn't provide this big spike of nicotine in the bloodstream. It's just a sustained amount. And so I say, we can prescribe this. I have a note that I send to the school so they know what our goals are. Usually I will tell parents, you can put on a nicotine patch in the morning. They can go to school. That is their business. They don't have to go to the nurse to ask for that. But I like to include it in my note so that the school knows where we're at in the process, so they can support the family and the patient. And also for breakthrough cravings, I like the gum, because first off, the gum and the lozenge don't taste good. So the lozenge is a little grosser than the gum. I tried it just so I would know. I'm like, yeah, that's gross. But it is way better for them to do that than to go revert back to their very tasty vapes. They are really appetizing. So anyway, they can go to their school nurse. I try to do it. You can do it every hour if you need to, but that's really taking away from the educational experience. I think if they're having to run to the nurse, that's why the patch is nice, because it helps provide a basal amount of nicotine in the bloodstream so that they don't need the breakthrough medication as frequently. So I say every 3 hours you can go to the nurse and they can administer one of the gum from the packages, and then I expect them to use it there. So I want the student to, with the nurse, put it in their mouth, chew it a little bit so that it releases the nicotine, and then they pouch it next to their gum so that the nicotine can be released through the mucosa, and that way it brings down the craving. It doesn't last very long. That gum's about 10 minutes. So once they've got it, that way they can't go and take it or save it or give it to somebody else. That's why I like the nurse to administer it, and then they can go on their way and then spit it out about 10 minutes later whenever they're done with it. But basically saying too, I also put in there, our goal is in the following week, we're going to reduce our dose of nicotine through the patch. And then the next week, we're going to do an even smaller nicotine dose patch. And by week 4, we're not going to wear a patch. So your student may actually be coming to you a bit more frequently for that gum for breakthrough cravings. But we're going to hope that is just a periodic change so that we can space that out over time. So I use a taper method to help decrease their overall nicotine exposure. And then I partner with the school nurse. And then I have my contact information if they have questions or concerns, or if they have a setback. And we need to redirect.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
We'll transition over to Jody. So, Jody, what is your experience, or what advice would you give to those working to pass local level policy?
Well, I think that one of the keys is that every community is different, or every work site, or every school district, or wherever you're working, and to start where they are. In Fort Scott, and I know a lot of communities in Southeast Kansas, that policy as far as tobacco cessation or smoke-free environments can be really divisive. And so just be prepared on having those voices that are, saying that it's their rights to be able to smoke where they want to, whenever they want to. Even in work sites, it was really just an obstacle, but you just need to be compassionate and start where they are, because these individuals are addicted. And so it's not an easy feat to quit, number one, and then to think, well, now I'm not going to be able to go on my break, or I'm not going to be able to do to be able to get to the device, or to get the nicotine needed to help soothe me. We also have issues with parents that are buying the devices for kids in our school districts. And so, parents think it's their right to be able to give these kids these vaping devices. And then they call the school mad because they want their device back. And and convenience stores not being non-compliant with the laws, and then enforcement issues that go along with that too. So there's just a lot of different things and obstacles and barriers that you will come up with, and to be prepared with that. So just have a very clear understanding of the landscape that you're going to be walking into, and any of the primary data that you can have to share is going to be just key. Just like the previous presentation about how half of kids really want to quit and half of them have tried, because a lot of times kids get a bad rap that they are just wanting to smoke and wanting to use vapes, and that's that. Well, the truth is that these kids are inhaling a massive amount of nicotine, and they are absolutely addicted at this point, and they just need help. So we need to make it easier for those kids so that they can quit. In our communities, in rural communities, we have other barriers, transportation, having support systems at home, those types of things. So just work and listen and ask questions, raise awareness and collaborate with different organizations, work with key personnel. I know sometimes school resource officers kind of get a bad rap when it comes to moving to a more restorative approach versus a punitive approach in school systems. But it's been my experience that the school resource officer has been my best friend when it comes to policy, because the school resource officer, he doesn't want to constantly have those kids that are just recidivizing. They just keep coming back, and those school resource officers really want those kids to get the actual help that they need, and not just constantly getting those fines or whatever consequences that are dealt out. And finally, just be compassionate, and work with the schools, tell the stories because they need to be told, because pictures and having faces of the kids and youth tells a lot more than just the data.
So Vince, you might be able to chime in on this from a school perspective as well, but how do you get community and partners involved in, these vaping initiatives?
Well, what we did in the school system is we worked with like all of the school personnel, and we also have community champions and communities in the school too. So they are instrumental in helping us reach more of our population of focus and our low income and those who are more susceptible to chronic illness and those types of populations. And we also reach out to, other outside agencies and build up a system, a referral system for tobacco cessation services or transportation services, and actually provide those services inside the school system. So it kind of removes the barriers for transportation, for finding time and getting parental support at home for those cessation and prevention. We also worked with the business class and had the kids come up with their own campaign. And so being able to work with outside community organizations on developing that community-wide campaign, so it's shared across the community itself. And Vince, I'm sure you have a lot more to add to that.
Well, you're actually kind of saying exactly what we do with our Reno County Health Department here. So there's really not a whole lot I can add on that. Getting our next big step, though, is really trying to get the parents to support this. And so our Resist Kids, when we have parent-teacher conferences or any open house, things like that, we're going to have those kids out there, giving their pamphlets out to the parents, trying to educate them. Because honestly, a lot of parents, I know you mentioned, and we have them as well, those parents who do supply those to the kids, but then we have a lot of kids who when they get caught and I make that call to the parents and we talk about it, they're shocked. And they just, my kid would never do that. And, and so getting them aware and things to look for, that is the big thing. And so that's about it for us.
And then have you found that, these outside resources, these community partners, are they're willing to put in some work and willing to work with you?
In our experience, yeah, you just got to be careful and make sure that your priorities are aligning, and don't make any assumptions, because sometimes you assume that this is going to be a top priority for a community partner or organization, where they'll acknowledge it is a priority, but maybe not their top priority. And so just work with them and their capacity and what resources they have. We're all struggling in rural communities and throughout, and we all have lack of human resources, financial resources, whatever. And so we're all in this together. And so just see how you can leverage and build upon each other's strengths and just accomplish what you're trying to get together.
And then Jody, can you tell us about an experience that you've had working with higher risk populations in your community?
Yeah, a good example of that would be our work that we did in the multi-unit housing development in one of our really very, very small communities. It's a elderly senior housing, disabled units, and they did not have a smoke-free policy. And we know that, you know, if you're smoking in one unit, seeps through the walls, it seeps through the air conditioning and the venting and all of that. So it just creates an unhealthy environment for everybody living in that facility. We did not want to be seen as the organization coming in that's trying to kick them out of their houses if they continue to smoke. That wasn't what we wanted. We wanted everybody to live in a healthy environment. So it just takes time and sitting down. And I went and I sat down and I knocked on doors and sat down with individuals. And I'm a previous smoker myself, so I'm able to really empathize with, like, you know, quitting sucks. It's hard. So what can we do to help you? And once you visit with people and you let them know that you really do care about them as individuals and you want to get them help, everybody wanted to have the tools to quit. I'm not sure if they had the confidence they needed to quit or the support systems in place to quit. But after about a year and having social events in the courtyard and bringing all of the tenants together and just talking it out, we were really impressed with the overall acceptance of the policy to not smoke in their units and to help everybody live in healthier environments.
And so what is your experience like when you talk to these people? Do they even know that some of these resources are available? How do you kind of guide them to those resources?
You know, I think for the most part, a lot of people realize that the resources are available. They're just not in their reach. So when you have a community that's 30 miles outside of the larger community, you know, you don't have transportation, you're disabled, you know, it's not anything that you really feel like you can reach. So knowing that those services, we can connect you with services that will actually come to you, and it's okay to ask for that help too, I think meant a lot.
Thank you. And then we'll turn this over to Tony. So, you know, you're kind of, I don't want to say not unpopular, but you kind of take an unpopular, you know, stance with, you know, how you as an SRO maybe deal with, you know, these vaping infractions. So how does your school work with students who are caught vaping?
Yeah, so I was interested to hear that Jody works so closely with the school resource officer. And it's interesting to hear kind of some of the words that she uttered and how the way we do things might go just a little bit differently from that. Dr. Van Frank started her presentation off with a reference to an Attorney General quote. And the Attorney General had said that the approach to this challenge should be multifaceted, should be a team approach. And certainly, if you're not already, then law enforcement and your school resource officer should be a part of the team, a part of the mix, valuable asset. But when we have a student here in the building that's been caught with a vape, my portion of this is pretty short and sweet. We don't write tickets. We just don't do it. We try to focus on the rehabilitative rather than the punitive. And talking with kids that come into our office, the teeth, the real switching of the behavior with the ticket, it just doesn't work at all. Now, that's not to say that law enforcement should do nothing at all. Relationship, and just the example here in the building, this is just one example. We have an honors chemistry teacher that every year will come down and ask for any confiscated vapes that we have. and to his class, he'll assign assignment, and the students will have to do tests on the actual vape cartridges themselves, and they'll have to look at all the carcinogens, all the deadly things that are in the vape, and then the teacher has the student come up with a PowerPoint presentation. And then part of the assignment is that the students have to go out and they have to do that PowerPoint presentation to their peers, to their other students. So it's not the police officer that's like, don't do that. It's actually their peers that come together and work together to get a culture, a thought, a kind of a common thought that's not how we want to do things here. So it's much more positive than that.
And I know in past conversations we had, you have talked about how you kind of have an open door policy at your school. What does that look like for you?
Well, we did. I mean, the door's open all the time for the students, and quite literally, we have students in here all the time, and it's amazing. Even with the suit on, how open they are about what they did last weekend or what's going on in the school, etc. And there's also another officer we have two officers that are assigned to this high school. And one of the things that we even role play through sometimes, the two of us, is if a student comes in and mentions the challenges that they're having, and most of the kids, I totally agree with a lot of the research. Most of them that come in, they don't want to be doing it. And so us as adults, we make sure that we're saying the same thing, the other SRO and I, and that we work very closely with the social workers and the mental health aspect of this walk through the challenge. So we're up there all the time and trying to get the kids resources rather than taking a lightning bolt out of the sky and throwing it at them every time they get out of line. We're walking hand in hand with them, and it's really cool. And I hope that everybody as they walk through the ECHO and they come up with their specific plans for their own communities, that they're able to have success stories like success stories that we've had here in our building. So.
And so you talk about, you've kind of shifted this culture within your schools. Police aren't always the most popular figures. Have you always had that sort of relationship with your students where they felt like they could just come and talk to you? Or do you feel like you guys took some steps so that maybe you guys weren't, no offense, more intimidating to your students?
Well, I think it starts with the selection process of the police officer. The school district, the police department, while they're doing selections, they should have oral boards, and members of the school district should be able to ask questions, and they should be able to choose the person that they feel like. I mean, they should have buy-in that's going to be able to communicate and work with the kids. And it's not an easy job. Coming into a school right off as a new SRO, they hear comments. But anyway, after time goes, as long as the buy-in is there, then the trust gets there. We did a grant here at our school, and the grant was for an Xbox. And we've got a big screen TV in our office, and as long as the students have got a pass, they get permission from their teacher, and they're caught up on grades, and they can come in here and chill, and just blow off steam. So it's cool to see how, I mean, they talk to somebody in uniform that stuff that anyway, yeah.
And then there was a question in the chat. I think most people can get on board with the rehabilitation focus, but where does the legal burden lay with reporting possession? Is this determined by local policy in collaboration with law enforcement? My concern is that in my training, I am compelled to report a law.
Sure.
I'm compelled to report that a law is broken, including tobacco possession. Is there any state law or legislation that has been passed to relieve educators / administrators of this burden to grant this leniency for the sake of helping our students?
Yes.
You might have you probably have experience and an opinion on that. I also know we'll talk about that in a later ECHO session. And I think she's in this Zoom call. So Angie, if you're available, would you be okay with answering that question? And Tony, or if you have an opinion on that or as well?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's great.
Yeah, so a few years ago, the law changed to say essentially that you don't have to report every criminal act that happens at school, but that's a conversation that you have with your local law enforcement. So you should have a memorandum of understanding with local law enforcement, probably your county attorney, those parties in interest in reporting criminal acts that says the types of things that you'll report. So if you have an interest in going the way that Officer Woolen has gone with Shawnee Mission, all you would need to do is check out that MOU, see what it says, and possibly reconvene the team if you wanted to loosen up on some of that reporting. I think you'll find, and I could be surprised, but I think you'll find that a lot of you that have, maybe more sheriff contact, because you don't have municipal police available, or you maybe don't have an SRO, that some of those smaller offenses are not things that they necessarily want to spend all their time with anyway. So yeah, that is all that takes is adjusting that MOU collectively to ensure that you don't have to report those things anymore.
Tony, I wasn't sure if you had anything to add.
Well, just probably just kind of to reiterate what Angie said, in that, we don't need to know everything every time a pencil's stolen. I mean, technically it's a crime, but the bigger picture is our administration here, because of the relationship that we've built, we're in meetings and we're working with them all the time, and they want to tell us everything. And so it's because we have danced together long enough, then there's nothing that we do in the building that we don't let administration know. And it's just that trust factor. They tell us all that stuff as well. With not writing the tickets, not taking the punitive posture, then we feel it's in line with the way the laws are with like Senate Bill 367 and I know we're going to talk more about that later on, but we do have, as law enforcement, we do have the ability to meander through that gray area. And the place that we have decided to stand is to not write tickets for tobacco.
An excellent question. Thank you, Angie and Tony. And we'll definitely cover all that legality stuff in way more detail. And I believe it's ECHO 3. Yep, Angie's shaking her head. It sounds right. I'm guessing correctly. Yeah, that's fantastic. And then, finally, I just want to circle back to, Vince and Tony and, whoever else feels like they may have some more information. So you've kind of shifted away from this more punitive approach. What resources are you providing your students in terms of education and, cessation? We know Dr. Van Frank provided a couple. Are you taking advantage of those? Dr. Olinger, do you have other resources that maybe she didn't provide that you think are useful to know?
I think it's important to make sure that you're engaged with your local primary care providers. And if you happen to know folks in the community that are really comfortable with helping support kids who need nicotine replacement, that's great. But we actually did a study, and you'll, I'm sure, learn more about it. But a lot of providers aren't doing very well in terms of providing this nicotine replacement. So if that's a resource that's lacking for you, please let us know, because that's part of what we're trying to do, is make sure that providers are comfortable and they can collaborate with school systems and parents to get the resources that students need to be successful, because this is not taught in medical school. So it's not one of the things that you have to study for boards to become a certain provider, but it is so practical and so important. And across the state of Kansas, we learned that there are significantly less providers than I thought there would be to help out with this. And we want to make sure that everyone has a medical provider that they can partner with.
Thank you. Vince, Tony, what kind of resources are your schools providing in terms of education and cessation?
Well, we have actually the Stanford curriculum. We use that with our traditional classes, with an advisory class, and then also in our that's what our PE teachers use in their health unit. And then if a student gets caught, we provide them with EverFi. It's a relatively shorter session that educates kids on tobacco use. And then if they get caught again, then I actually use one, Vape Educate, and it's one that I have to pay for. And it is a very good program, and it is one where I believe it's 6 different sessions, and you have to pass each session with like an 80% before you can move on to the next one. So, you know, a kid can't just click and go, poo, 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 I'm done. If they don't do well, they have to go back and rewatch everything and work back through it. And so those are the 2 primary ones we use, especially if a student gets caught with anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for Bryce, for us, it's Aspire. Then the student will do just like what Vince talked about. They'll go and do it online. Mm-hmm.
I'll pose this question to the group, or we'll hit this one first because this is about this education piece. So what if the student refuses to do the education option?
Well, we have not had that situation happen yet. So, and honestly, we've never thought about it. But, you know, I guess to me, that's part of this process. Hey, we're keeping you here. We want you to learn. And so you know, if we need to say, okay, you're staying in the office till you work through this, then so be it. I mean, that's just my off the cuff response. But we feel that it's that important that these kids start, you know, take advantage of this opportunity to learn what they're doing to their bodies and their minds. And we've been very fortunate. All of the parents that we've had to deal with this have been very supportive of their kids working through the different programs.
I'll pose this question to the group. Do adults that buy vapes for underage teens in high school or middle schools ever get held accountable for buying these products for minors? As mentioned before, that parents buy the vape and then call the school to claim it back. I know that we should probably first offer information and resources, but is there anything else that we can help with?
Bryce, I can just say that here we have parents that come in and say, hey, my kid bought it from this kid and then bought it from a store owner. And as far as the law enforcement perspective goes, then we will, depending on where that store is, we'll pass that information on to the local jurisdiction so that they can start an investigation. So when we get the information, it doesn't fall on, it goes somewhere.
Fantastic. So I guess at this point, I'll open it up to the group. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments? feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question if you would like. You can also put it in the chat. I think I've caught up with all of our questions. Someone's asking about sharing restorative practices again. Ellie mentioned that, you know, a lot of this information is covered in our toolkits that you can find on the KDHE website. But just to, you know, kind of recap on what we've talked about here, is the Aspire Educate program. And then the Vape Educate was one that Vince really appreciated. Is there anyone else I'm missing? You know, I'll give it a couple more seconds for any last minute questions, so we don't have to all look at each other awkwardly, but all right.
All right, I think with that, thank you to our panelists, good information, and thank you for being willing to share your time. And we are going to transition to the next portion of our summit. We've got Ellie and Bryce is going to continue on talking about shifting mindset, how collaborative and action-oriented approaches to address tobacco in schools may be an avenue to explore. So I'll turn it over to Ellie and Bryce.
No, just in case you didn't get enough of me. Yeah, so you know, I don't have control of this. Next slide, please. You know, before we kind of get into, you know, changing the culture within your schools and maybe some best practices, I do kind of want to talk about how we got here in the first place. So this is actually a quote taken from R.J. Reynolds, the tobacco company, in 1984. They have already identified as far back as, you know, now it's been about 40 years, but it probably goes back even further, that if, you know, they've identified that younger adult smokers are really their only source of replacement smokers. They've recognized that as a tobacco company, if they can hook their consumers early on in life, they are more likely to have lifelong customers who are able to generate a substantial amount of profits for the industry. Next slide, please. You know, they're kind of in this unique predicament. The tobacco industry is really the only industry that I can think of in the world that if you use their product as intended, kills about half of its users. You know, this is really putting them in this awkward or unique situation where they're constantly needing to replace the consumers who have died from using their products, right? You know, according to numerous internal tobacco industry documents that have been revealed in lawsuits, these companies have identified markets as early as 13 years of age as key demographics to target for their products. And, you know, this isn't new. The industry has historically studied the smoking habits of adolescents and young adults and how that their nicotine products affect their developing brains. And they, you know, they engineer their marketing campaigns to specifically target them. You know, we've done great work over the past few decades in terms of, you know, cigarette smoking and, you know, how that prevalence has declined over the years. But this has only encouraged really to the tobacco industry to get creative with their new and emerging products. Again, they do need these kids to replace the smokers that are dying from using their products. And this is always going to be an industry that is going to put profit over the well-being of the people. Next slide, please. And so while the tobacco industry, you know, they claim that they no longer target kids and young adults anymore, they still use, you know, predatory marketing tactics to attract kids to their products. This includes enticing flavors, colorful packaging, and then names and other logos that are similar to popular types of candies. You know, it goes deeper than that too. They're strategically placing their product you know, at eye level for, you know, young adults and kids. They're placing it in locations that are near candy or, you know, other popular areas. And it's all, you know, you see it in all over the place, you know, grocery stores, convenience stores, gas stations. And they're promoting their product on social media with popular influencers. And this is all to kind of destigmatize, you know, the use of the tobacco product. Furthermore, they also have their own, youth prevention campaigns. This isn't really to keep kids from smoking, but it's more of like a public relations ploy. So these laws and policies aren't put in place to restrict their predatory marketing practices. Next slide, please. Maybe. This one has 2 pictures, I think. Yeah, so just to kind of put a visual with what I'm talking about, you can see that these vaping and tobacco products are placed next to candy in what looks like a cash register at a gas station. And then you can see on the right how they're using popular candies like sour gummy worms, Swedish fish, all that stuff, flavors that they're familiar with, and that may entice them to use their product. I also do want to mention that, with it being a new and emerging product, the nicotine levels vary really widely among brands. So some can have upwards to 100, the equivalent to 100 cigarette, that nicotine level in their juice pods. And that's all just to really get them hooked from the get-go. Next slide, please. And then again, if they weren't targeting youth, why would they feel the need to, have these products? Adults have no need for these products. There's, the keychain, the hoodie string that you can vape into, inhaler. I've heard, there's like ones that look like Apple Watches that you can inhale. And then again, I do want to mention those highlighters because I've heard it from other youth coordinators in the state that's a new and emerging product. And I believe I can't remember if it was Dr. Van Frank or one of the panelists mentioned it. And then I even had my girlfriend the other day, she knows I'm involved in this work. She was like, did you know that they had these highlighters that look like vapes? And so it's just kind of crazy, all the different platforms that they'll really push these products out, to entice youth to use their products. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, Big Tobacco's marketing has worked. A significant number of, teenagers and young adults use their products. And this, at first it was Juul, now it's more like Puff bars and Elf bars. But this is all really due to their discreet design and appealing flavors. Again, it's unfortunately worked so much that the U.S. Surgeon General declared a vaping epidemic in the United States. So we're kind of gonna look at maybe what that data looks like in Kansas. Next slide, please. So I'll just touch on this a little bit. Dr. Van Frank mentioned some of this already, but about 1 in 7 Kansas high school students, a little under 15%, use tobacco products, cigarettes, e-cigarettes, cigars, or smokeless tobacco. I do want to mention this is actually down from about roughly 20% in 2019. So that's fantastic news. That 5% drop is fantastic. I always, I like to think of this data kind of in a bubble because I do have to recognize that a lot of this data was collected over the COVID pandemic where, students were at home doing virtual learning. So maybe they were monitored a little bit more. Again, as Dr. Van Frank mentioned, there's a huge social aspect to vaping. So students were puffing on their vape and then passing it on to their friends. So we'll see in the future if these trends continue. And then among youth who use tobacco products, a little more than a third use 2 or more, that dual use. So that could be vaping in cigarettes or cigars, for example. Next slide, please. And then of students who tried vape for the first time, across the board, roughly 9 out of 10 students, their first initiation with that vape was using a flavor. That includes menthol, candy flavors, fruit, mint, or some sort of alcoholic drink. Next slide, please. So this is all to say that this has kind of just made this perfect storm. The flavors are making it really easy to hit. The sleek devices are making it super easy and convenient to hide. And then this really unregulated nicotine levels are making it extremely difficult to quit. Next slide. So I do want to hit on, just briefly on these 3 levels of prevention. At the top, you see tertiary prevention. That's more of that cessation protocol. And then, throughout ECHO, we're really going to hit on this primary prevention. How can we stop it at the source before it ever really becomes an issue? Next slide. So what does a model policy look like in your schools? So a comprehensive tobacco-free policy is going to include all students and staff, all visitors, all tobacco products on all school grounds. So that's even including contractors, at football stadiums, at football games, etc. We want to ensure that this isn't being initiated on school campus at all. These recommendations are from KASB, and the Kansas Department of Health and Environment worked in conjunction with them to create these recommendations. You'll see there's 2 policies you can really select. There's option 1 or option 2. Option 1 is going to be that referral to law enforcement. That is something we do not recommend at all. We want them to stay away from that punitive punishment to this more restorative approach, which is an option 2. Next slide, please. So why do we want tobacco-free grounds? Well, it really creates this healthier environment to reduce exposure to secondhand smoke and discourages tobacco use among students and staff. High schools and middle schools are really play a crucial role in developing student behaviors and attitudes. And by implementing these tobacco-free policies, schools can set a positive example by demonstrating the importance of making healthy choices and respecting each other's well-being in terms of secondhand smoke. Next slide, please. I'm over here clicking it on my computer, like that'll work. So what are best practices? Again, we don't want to really enforce, or we don't want them to refer to law enforcement, but we do want to confiscate the product and inform parents and refer to education or cessation practices. According to the U.S. Department of Education, these punitive punishments are more likely to be enforced on, these minority populations. So that's, ethnic groups, racial identity, gender identity, and these punitive punishments are more likely to be enforced on Black communities. So when we talk about best practices, KDHE again worked with KASB to work with to create a disciplinary protocol. So on first offense, we want to notify this parent or guardian. We want to meet with school staff to inform the parents on the dangers of vaping and tobacco use, and then we want to provide them with education and cessation resources. Again, if you feel like you need this slap on the wrist, although I'm kind of half and half on it, you can bar them from extracurricular activities for a certain amount of time. I'm always hesitant to recommend that, just because a lot of times those extracurricular activities are the only thing keeping them, involved with school, giving them that community at school. And then when we go to second offense, we want to do the same as before, except now we want to require them to do this prevention education, such as Aspire or the Vape Educate that Tony and Vince mentioned in our panel discussion. And then on the third offense, now we can really identify that this is not a behavioral issue. This student is addicted. So how can we provide them cessation resources and education to help them quit? Next slide, please. And I just really want to emphasize this. Shifting away from a punitive approach to a more restorative approach is going to have triple the benefit. We want students to stay in school. It's going to improve their academics. They're more likely to graduate. They're more likely to go to a post-secondary education. And again, if you're just going to suspend the kids, all they're going to do really is they're just going to go home and vape unsupervised. in my opinion, I would much rather, keep them in the school where they have that adult supervision and, support them along their quit journey. Next slide, please. We'll just briefly go over this. Again, these are some more alternative to suspension programs. Tony, you mentioned Aspire. Someone mentioned the Stanford Medicine Toolkit. I think that was Vince. And then In-Depth was also mentioned. You're certainly not limited to those. There are a bunch of different resources that are provided in our toolkits. Next slide, please. And then I do want to touch on, vape sensors. These are sensors that, are typically installed in bathrooms, not always. They supposedly have the benefit on being able to catch or detect vapor smoke. This is not something that KDHE recommends. First, it's about changing the culture in the school, right? So if you're going to use this as a gotcha, and then just go ahead and suspend them, you're not really addressing the issue. Whereas, maybe I could see this being justified if you're using this to detect vaping smoke, but then you're providing them with, education or cessation resources. Again, these sensors are super expensive. They can get $1,000 to $2,000 per sensor. And I grew up, when Juul was an emerging device in high school. And quite honestly, as a high school student, you're going to put these up, and students are not dumb. They're going to find ways around this. They're going to figure out where these detection devices are fairly quickly. I'm sure you've all seen it. When I was in high school, they would just take the vape and then, blow it into their shirt to, dissipate that smoke so it wasn't as detectable. And these aren't always the most effective. I've heard from past cohorts that they've installed these in bathrooms, and then they didn't go off right away. But then a student who actually needed to use the restroom opened the door, circulated the air, and then that caught them, even though they weren't actually the one vaping. And then I do want to hit on some of these detection devices do have links to the tobacco industry, which may or may not indicate, really how effective are these devices. Next slide, please. And then finally, I do want to, do my shameless plug for Resist. Resist, as Vince mentioned, is against tobacco, but we're not against the tobacco user. We're against the tobacco industry. We have recognized that youth and young adults are victim to big tobacco's predatory marketing tactics. So this is about changing your culture within the schools, educating ourselves, educating our peers on why, vaping and tobacco use is not the best for you. I have found that, students really care about, they all know what they do to what that vaping does to your physical well-being, but they really care about what that does to your, mental well-being, your emotional well-being. And they aren't always aware of that. So that's really the goal of Resist, is that we're educating our peers and we're taking community action to prevent this initiation. Next slide. I think this is
Okay, I'll take it from here. Thanks so much, Bryce. So I'm Ellie Levins, and my job really is to kind of zoom way back out, talk about where we are and where we're headed. And I think every presenter maybe has said it, but I'm going to also say it, that we really want to think about something that underlies this whole program, which is that youth and young adults have been specifically targeted by the tobacco industry. I'm pulling a quote from Lorillard, but you can go to any tobacco company. All of them have been shown to have some statement like this in their documents. Lorillard says the base of our business is the high school student, and they funneled tons of resources to grab the attention of youth and young adults. And we know that at this point, you guys have heard it a number of times, e-cigarettes contain very high levels of very, very addictive nicotine, making it incredibly hard to quit. And we know that especially with youth and young adults, that nicotine quickly causes physical and behavioral dependence. And because of this, no amount of of discipline is going to result in a student quitting. We absolutely have to align with them and give them the resources and the support that they need to make that change, that really difficult change. And so we see your all's role, and hopefully this is kind of solidifying over today's presentations, that our roles are to align with students and combat that addiction. And so I want to reiterate something that we've heard a couple of times here, which is that dependence is something that you will see, and you'll see it in school in a number of ways. First is this repeated offense, repeatedly going against the policies, repeatedly ending up in the office with these infractions, maybe going to the parking lot to vape, vaping in the bathroom, students who are anxious or irritable, restless, unable to concentrate. All of these things would be good reasons to begin to have a conversation about, hey, is there maybe something else going on here? Is there something that we can do to support you? And I choose, similar to Dr. Van Frank, to see some good news here, which is, like she mentioned, statewide data shows that about half of US high school students that reported tobacco also attempted to quit in the last year. So there is this myth that students just don't care, they don't want to quit. And maybe that's true for some, but for the majority, they actually have put in effort to actively make quit attempts in the past year, which gives us a great opportunity to step in and support them further and help them be successful in that. So I want to acknowledge that maybe some of you are already at a place where this is not a shift in mindset, but there may be some of you where we're asking you to really shift fundamentally the way that you think about nicotine use, tobacco use, and that may be a difficult thing to do. So I want to reiterate that we are here, and that is our job to support you in that shift in mindset, and that shift kind of maybe also looks like looking at new goals. So aligning with the student to combat their dependence on nicotine. And really the hardest work of all of it is shifting the school culture to allow students to seek support from trusted adults and feel and trust that if they need support in their efforts to quit, that they can kind of come to you all and get that support and not be fearful of punitive measures. And so I'm going to give a sort of teaser of things to come, because of course we've talked a lot about the problem today. And so now going forward, now it's time to really equip everyone with the information to build an action plan that is really tailored to your school. So some of the things we're going to talk about and the areas that we're going to cover are looking at policy and ensuring that a vaping policy is evidence-based, and that rather than triggering punitive measures, it triggers cessation interventions and support. We're going to give you information about how to make evidence-based referrals to cessation programs. We're going to provide resources, even scripts of how to go through that. We're going to talk a lot about how repeated offerings of intervention are really a primary piece of evidence-based care for these students, and that this is true even after a lapse, that those are learning opportunities, and that they're an opportunity to move forward with that student and align with them again. We're going to talk about repeated follow-ups as a way to understand progress, to cheerlead for the patients or for the students who are having success, to provide further support to those who need it. We're going to talk about how to have collaborative, respectful, and student-led conversations around vaping. And we're going to talk about how to help students engage with trusted adults and ask you to think creatively about who those individuals might be. Might it be a coach or a teacher, a trainer, nurse, pediatrician? The list goes on and on. And I will also give a plug. I know Hina has put links in the chat, but these next two sessions that we're going to have are really going to focus on what can we do about cessation and how do we have those conversations in a way that allows students to feel heard and to hear the information that you all are providing to them. So just to get the juices flowing a little bit, we're going to talk about your community, and are there individuals in your specific community that you could partner with? We're going to talk about some of the alternatives to suspension, adult-led programs, and also some referrals you can make to more student-led programs as well. Okay, so zooming all the way out, we are in our second session, and now moving forward, we're going to have 7 sessions going forward. The first on sort of the introduction to addiction and cessation. A lot of what we'll talk about here are referrals and resources that are available to all of you. Session 2 will get into putting that information into practice. Again, how to have those conversations in a way that allows the student to feel heard and to allow them to hear you. We're going to talk about policy and best practices and legal challenges, some of which we touched on today. Then in session 4, we'll talk about the student-centered approach, then developing community partnerships. And we're really going to dive into action plans. This is where you all really take over and jump into the driver's seat, developing that action plan. And then we get to hear one of, I think, our hub team's very favorites. We get to hear all about the success that you all have had in implementing those programs. We are very excited. So thank you.
As Bryce and Ellie kind of wrap things up here, I've been looking at the chat, but I haven't seen any questions. I don't know if there are any questions around this particular piece. We'll give it a minute or two and then we'll wrap up for the day. I don't, oh, there we go. Any questions? Going once, going twice. All right, next slide, please. So this is probably new territory for every single one of us. It was to me as a former building administrator, but as educators, we're used to being sort of uncomfortable and trying something new. So I would encourage you to embrace a little bit of that uncertainty, to understand this is new territory. This is maybe even personally a completely different mindset shift that you may have to do as we work through these next several sessions. This is a cumulative process. We're not going to get into our first echo in September and you're all of a sudden going to have all of the answers. Everything is kind of like math. It's sequential and it builds on each other. And by the time we get to April, you'll be like, oh, that proverbial light bulb will go off. Each echo time has time for you to work within your school teams. So don't feel like we're going to assign all this homework. You have 50 calculus problems and you have to do them all tonight. We will be providing class time, to use an educational parlance, for you to work on your action plan and to have those collaborative conversations with your team. You're also going to be grouped in breakout sessions to foster, have those collaborations, what's working for your district, what's working for our district. If you've been in education any length of time, you know that the best ideas are usually stolen from another teacher, another administrator, another district. And this will give you some opportunities to visit with other school districts to see what's working for them. And if you're worried about the action plans, please don't be. I promise as we go through these echo sessions, it'll become clear kind of where you are as a community, as a school district, as a school building, and how to build that action plan so that you have some positive outcomes. Next slide, please. Some have expressed concern about the amount of time this may take. We don't anticipate the need for much work by teams outside of the echo sessions, maybe an hour, 2 tops. Between those sessions, and those sessions, of course, you'll recall, are spaced 2 weeks apart. The case studies that you submit will be used to make sure discussions and work are relevant to your school environment. So if you've not submitted a case study, please do that. And the ECHO team is super sensitive to your feedback. There's going to be a survey, as you might expect when we are done here. Please let us know your thoughts, your observations, and suggestions so we know how this is meeting your needs. Next slide, please. Just a kind of housekeeping things. If you have had some shifts in your school team, that's fine. Staffing changes happen, but please make sure all school team participants have completed the registration and the pre-test. This is super important, particularly for our survey information. So all school team members need to get themselves registered and take the pre-test. And I think they're dropping that in the chat as I speak. Your school team lead or your lead contact, if you've not uploaded your current tobacco policies and or your case, please make sure you do that. That's come out in an email several times, but I'm pretty sure I'll be sending that out again when I send out the stuff from today's session. Next slide, please. We've got a survey for you. The survey is unique to each participant, and we send it to the email address school team members use to register. That's why that registration piece is so important to us. For our non-school participants, you'll be sent a separate survey link after the summit. And as always, we just appreciate the time that you take. It's less than 5 minutes. Please let us know what you found valuable, thoughts, observations. We do take that to heart. And then to kind of wrap it up, our last slide, if you are thinking about obtaining credit or certificate of attendance, you might grab your phone real quick, take a picture of this slide, even though I am going to send it out. You've got till September 5th at 5 p.m. to enter the code and to follow through with the steps required to make sure you can earn the credit that you need. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Hina. My computer shows right at 11:20. I don't know if Hina has any follow-up information. I just want to close by saying thank you to our participants today, our panelists, our presenters. Thank you to our schools that are here today and our community partners. We appreciate you taking time to be with us today. I know it was kind of on the longer side, but really, really good information. And I'm just humbled and gratified to be sitting in with this esteemed group. So Ms. Hina, if you have anything else we need to do, we will let you speak and go on from there.
Thank you so much, Robin. So thank you all for participating in today's summit. I know we had a mix of school participants and then stakeholders. And so thank you again for taking the time. The hub team will stay on if there's any questions until 11:30. And then we wish you the best and a wonderful Labor Day as well.